So we're all hooked up?
We are hooked up and recording.
All right, cool.
All right. So I'm here to repair any harm that I've perpetrated, to develop and strengthen self-care behaviors, and to realize the truth of my character. All right. So what I was, just like I was saying right before turning the recording devices on, I was hoping that you would be willing to share how you approach these sessions. Like you've told me before, like I do have some sense, but I'd like to listen really carefully, if you're willing.
Yeah, can you remind me what I've told you before? I don't recall what I actually expressed before.
What I remember is that you talked about feeling like you really needed to be present and attentive. And I remember it almost as an emptying. So like if I remember correctly, you talked about almost like a purification coming into these. Like you take it very seriously in the sense that you're aware that, this is my word now, but this is what I remember, this is how I took it, that you present a risk to the person sitting across from you, depending upon what you bring into the room with you. So to the extent that you're capable to be empty, again, my word, and pay careful attention. That was the extent of it. That's what I really remember.
Well, I think I might have said too that what I've learned from doing this with clients and people, my intention, because I have an intention too, just like you do. My intention is to be really grounded and centered and as emotionally, cognitively present with you as I possibly can be. And I think that kind of concept you said of emptying, I like that concept, because when I'm here, I'm here. I try not to think about anything else but what you and I are talking about. And to that degree, I think I've said this to you before too, I find this actually very meditative, because there's something freeing about just us focusing on each other. I know there's a world happening outside the room. Obviously, we can hear traffic go by and stuff like that, but there's also a freedom in doing this with you that I find very invigorating in a way. I think I shared with you, like when I did massage, there's a lot of the same experience where it feels like this flow of energy between the two of us. And I stopped doing massage when that stopped, when I no longer could feel that. And it's not that I expect you to give me anything, but in what we do, I feel like there is this exchange of energy between us that ends up feeding me too. Like I don't really need it to go home and do something with it, but I think the feeding is feeling connected to what's happening to you, or what you're feeling, or what you're thinking, and that's that spiritual thing in a way. I think that you and I both share, that there is something spiritual about what we do here, and I do take that very seriously. And fortunately, I have felt spiritual things in my life. I know a lot of people don't know what that is, and I have experienced and do understand that there's sort of another level of experience in this room, in our relationship too, and in the world. And I try to bring that to what we do together too.
Bring the awareness of that, whatever that is.
Of what the spirituality or spirit between us, and the connection in this room as we're talking about the things that are important to you to discuss. And maybe that comes back to the integrity for you, and my seriousness and your seriousness too, and what we do together is about maintaining integrity of yourself, integrity of myself as we do this together. Does that help?
It does very much. Thank you. Yeah. That's a very helpful orientation, I think. So you introduced, at the tail end there anyway, the sense of identity. And that's a really, really tricky thing, I think, the sense of identity. So I think I don't think we can help but address that. But so the context that I think that I want to set up here, which is what I was saying before we started, was for practical purposes, I'm about to get really busy in a bunch of domains of my life. So I guess I'm making a conscious decision to deprioritize the time with you. I made a conscious decision to prioritize it. About a month and a half ago, I said, can we set up a sequence of sessions, and knowing full well that I was in for at least some of what is about to happen here in January and February of 2023. Since setting that intention, there's been a couple other developments, the roommate one being one of them that I wasn't aware of when I set up that original intention. And then there's also increased urgency with respect to at least being prepared for, I'll say, negotiations in the context of my family of origin. So I've had a couple more. Ben and I just spent a couple of days out there this past week.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, it was really good. At the same time, it's actually affecting my sleep. I'm noticing that, I'm waking up in the morning and I'm saying, you're not done. There's work that you need to do. There's things that you need to tend to there. And I think I'm a pretty tolerant procrastinator. I would say that that's one of my, if there is such a thing as a character defect, that's a big one for me. And then, because I can tolerate a high degree of that, I'm just going to ignore it until it's a crisis circumstance. And it's reaching that point and it's been steadily building with respect to my family of origin for about a year now. And
mom and dad specifically, or the siblings too, or just everyone?
It's the whole show.
Okay.
It's so, and hopefully we'll have time I can flesh some of that out here, because that's probably the hardest thing for me to deal with. That's probably the hardest problem. That's the one that I'm not, or it's the one I'm most scared of, maybe. It's the one that I feel the most fear and trepidation about. Anyway, but I don't want to lose sight of what you just did, because you just teed it up beautifully in introducing the idea of spirit. And you said that a lot of people probably, they don't experience that. And I tend to think about it in that if it's a real thing, they're experiencing it. They just don't know it. They just don't have words for it, or they're not, the attention to it. They're just not I don't want to say just not. I don't know what they are, but I experience it as you're more or less aware.
I agree. I agree with you. It's there. It's whether you pay attention to it or not.
Yeah. So what gets interesting there, though, is the idea that there's somehow a spiritual. There's two spiritual identities, and I'm inclined to think about it in terms that any individuation is, in the ultimate sense, false. So it's more akin to what you and I do. The way that I experience it is that it isn't so much about being true to myself, being true to yourself. It's like being true to the self. It's like discovering the truth. I tend to talk about it as discovering the truth of the nature of reality.
Mm-hmm.
There's a spiritual reality that transcends all material form,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a dynamic thing, it seems, in the material form, or it's at least dynamic from the perspective of processes of perceptions housed in a material being, in that it looks like maybe it's shifting when it's not. It's a consequence of the shift in the material processes, I'll say.
That's why I've always liked the idea of the collective consciousness, that we're all part of a consciousness.
Yeah.
Even though physically we think we're individuated, I do also think it's a false dichotomy.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a necessary. So this gets to so this idea of harm. It's something that I really struggle with. It's something that I really struggle to understand. So anyway, so back to setting up the context of how I want to come at it today,
Mm-hmm.
or how I would propose to come at it today. So, So the first intention that I state is the intention to repair any harm that I have perpetrated.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really know how to do that. And I think that that's a lot of what I'm trying to do here is get to the particulars of how do I actually, I'm not even sure what all harm I have perpetrated.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's that intent that feels intuitively correct to place as the first priority, to mend errors. And I think just to put it bluntly and as directly as I can, I think it is errors in identification. So I think that the only way that I'm capable of perpetrating, well, you tell me what you think of this. This is my best articulation of it. The only way that I'm capable of perpetrating harm is through misidentification. That is acting upon the basis of an identity that is not true, as in not in accord with the fundamental nature of reality itself.
Mm-hmm.
So logically from that, then I say, okay, well, the path to repairing any harm is to rectify that process of identification. Become clear with what am I actually? What is my identity? What is the proper basis for any action? Okay, so to demonstrate then through example, because it's not particularly helpful. It is helpful to leave it to talk about it in abstract terms,
Mm-hmm.
but then there's the particulars of an individual human life.
Right.
So what I'd like to do then is take that and put it into context of my individual human life. There's a few particulars that I'll lay out, and I think that and then probably play with ordering those, because it comes down to I noticed that the day happens in order, like it's one thing after the next, and it's not random. So what comes first?
Mm-hmm.
What comes second, etc. So the issues at hand, I'll just rattle them off in no particular order. I mentioned that the roommate that I've been sharing my residence with is moving out this month, be gone by the end of this month, January. She's taken possession of the place that she's moving to, so she'll probably mostly be in the new place over the course of this month, and then this month she's paying me rent for this month, largely as a convenience, so that there isn't a rush to move everything all at once. So I'm contemplating what to do with the household, whether to bring another roommate in or not. So that's one complex of problems, I'll say, and then there's the other big milestone that's coming up is Benjamin's 18th birthday, which will be on November 13th of this year. And that is probably the easiest context to speak about identity or to address the issue of identity. And there's some real jeopardy with respect to harm there. And I think that is the cardinal relationship, the cardinal interpersonal relationship that I participate in my life. Father-son relationship that's given. And then the other complex is that of my family of origin, where obviously my parents continue to age in their capabilities to care for the household that they currently reside in, and contend with the realities of my siblings being there. So the identification and harm, potential jeopardy for harm in that particular context. I think that based on that first proposition that I made, that the capacity to do harm has to do with identification. Would you any objections, or is there anything you would want me to? You think does that sound right?
Yeah, I think I understand. Yes, because I think I understand what you're saying.
Because to try to put it succinctly, what I think I'm saying is that short of malevolent intent, if I properly apprehend the nature of all relationships, my relationship, the actual relationship with any person, place, or thing, another word for that apprehension of the nature of that relationship is understanding my proper identity, my actual identity, my truthful identity in the context of that relationship. So short of malevolent intent, if that's the case, I don't see how it's possible to do harm. Do you?
No, I mean, I know that you talked to your mom and dad, there's been conversations. I think as long as there's understanding and these conversations have gone on, there's always risk for harm, but you're doing your best.
Okay, so you and I maybe disagree on that point.
Okay.
That's when you say understanding, that's an abstract thing. Understand what? And I'm trying to be perfectly explicit and say, understand my true identity. If I understand my true identity, then I can't do harm. And you're saying, nah, that doesn't sound right to you. You still think that there's the potential for harm.
Well, I guess I'm saying I know we've talked about you talking to mom and dad about like taking care of your sister and I think your brother too at some point. I forget that part of the conversation. I guess the risk I'm referring to is there's risk from misunderstanding even through words with your mom and dad and what they want to happen once they leave this planet. That's why I'm saying that. Because words aren't perfect, even in the conversations you've had with them, I think, because of the imperfection of communication, i.e., or therefore, I guess, there is some potential risk for harm. But it doesn't mean it would be intentional. It could just mean, we can't read minds. We can hear words and hear intentions, but it's still not a perfect system. Does that make sense? Why I'm saying what I'm saying?
It does if you confine it to communications through words. I guess I would say that the jeopardy resides within. I think it really comes back to. I really do think that it's identification. It has to do with whether or not the individuals involved in the relationship understand who they actually are. Because if that's the case, they can. If that's the case and they have the capacity, that's the presence of mind, the cognitive capacity to realize that there is a margin of, there is the potential for misapprehension as a consequence of the limited processes of perceptions involved in the relationship. It doesn't have so much to do with the words. It has to do with the processes of perception and the capacity. But even foundational to that, I think, is the understanding of one's own identity.
But that assumes they have that done. Like they have their own understanding of identity, right?
Well, I can't. So, no, not for me. I don't assume that. I do not assume. I tend to. I'm going to invoke the serenity prayer, which goes, God, please grant me serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So that I cannot. I guess I'm convinced that I'm convinced that I exist fundamentally to worship God. So the primary orientation is to that relationship. So you might, I prefer the word God to collective consciousness, but I think they point in the same direction, roughly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the first thing that I must attend to in each and every moment. So far as I can tell, the very best that I can do is to turn every ounce of will that I have, any sense of individuated will, to consciously intend that it be put in service to the I'll say betterment of that relationship. I also think that I'm convinced, and if you got a different view, I'd really like to hear it. I'm really convinced that the extent of my influence on you or any other person, place, or thing that I am in relation to is limited only by my capacity to attend to that first priority. So if I'm doing that, attending to that to the greatest degree that I can, it's not up to me. Like I don't know to what degree you or anybody else is actually capable of doing that. So then the only harm then that can come to pass in any of those relationships then I guess arises as a consequence of my own failure to perfect that process or yours. Okay.
I can agree to that, or understand that.
Okay, so then from there, so that's the hardest one. That's the most abstract relationship to get right. So then all actions, then it gets easier, I think, because then because that relationship is unlimited, I think, technically. There's no limits to where that relationship can go, what can manifest in it. All other relationships are finite. They are limited. You and I are limited pretty severely by what it is that we're actually capable of bringing to realizing, I'll say. So I'll come to, I think it's easier to approach, I want to come back if we have time to the issue with my family of origin, but I think it's easier because of my own cognitive limitations here. Like I can only handle so much at a time, and I notice that if I can focus on one simpler pattern, the more likely I am to succeed and make progress. So I'd like to start with Ben, because that's simpler in the sense that it's one-on-one. It's also it's a primary natural relationship of father and son. It's an archetypal relationship. It's true at many levels of reality, in the sense that fathers and sons exist in all mammals. I won't belabor it, but the point is that one is if I have any chance of getting any right, like that one seems like it should be one of the easiest ones. Probably, I think it's the easiest. I think it's the least difficult one to get as right as possible. And I think I know that it's, for me, it is my first desire after the first one with my Creator. Okay, so there's this idea of individuation. So as a father, it seems obvious that it's up to me to define that person without their consent. It starts with the conception. And then just elaborates from there. I shouldn't say just, elaborates from there. So up to the point of conception, it has to do with selection of a mate. So there's the conscious, there's all of that process. Yeah. And then once that, then there's a commitment. And for me and Ben, it was like, I can remember the night he was conceived. It was very intentional. And he wasn't party to that, at least not at any conscious level for me. And then there's the imposition of my best sense of my identity encompassing that developing human. In practical terms, it's a house, food, the things that go with the more basic, well, I'll just say survival. So there's that, and then the same basic pattern of my imposition of, I'll say, my will, my sense of, depending upon, I'm acting on what I identify as, which is at base biological father, right? And then it elaborates up through the psychological, which for me incorporates the emotional, and then there's a spiritual aspect to it. Without splitting hairs too much here. So the culmination of that, and my intent from the beginning was to produce a fully formed human being to the greatest, to whatever ability. And I'm realizing in the conversations that I have with my dad in particular right now, gratefully, I still get to. He's still around, and I still get to carry on conversations, and I've recorded a few now with him just recently along these lines as well. And,
nice.
And I feel, I think I feel a peer to him. There's different domains of competence, but yeah, there's a sense there where I feel free, I guess, of that same imposition, I'll say. So my dad didn't do it as explicitly as I'm doing with Ben, which I think maybe it's my attempt to do better than my dad. Is to say, okay, we're just going to draw a line. I said just again. We're going to draw a line. I'm going to draw a line. So here it is. It's my final imposition upon you as a person. And the transition is that the responsibility for this human life transfers fully from me to you, Benjamin. So what do you think of that? And what do you think of the choice to impose that at? For me, so far I've been saying that happens at 18 years old, on the anniversary of your...
But say more what you mean about imposition. I'm not sure I know how you're defining that.
Well, I accept full responsibility for the desire to bring another human being into this world. That's an imposition on this world. The completion of that is I relinquish all responsibility for that human being. I strongly suspect that that's necessary for fulfillment of the potential of that human being. I think that if I don't do that, I inhibit the fulfillment of the potential of that human being.
Well, I guess it depends, maybe depends is the wrong word, then maybe behaviorally is the wrong word too, but then behaviorally, how do you see that happening or playing out? Like I hear the words, but then the actions, what would be the actions to that?
I negotiate with him as though he's a peer.
Okay.
So for me, again, so far as I can tell, I can construe all of life as an ongoing negotiation. So with him, I give him deference. I treat him as an inferior.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that he is inferior to me. In certain respects.
Mm-hmm.
And in a societal sense, he is in fact inferior to me in that he can't vote today.
Right.
At least not legally.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that's a natural marker that says, okay, you actually have available to you now a sense of identity that you didn't before, and that is a full-fledged citizen of the United States of America. So now your level of identity just expanded from child to fellow citizen. It went from familial to national.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens in coincidence with a number of solar cycles. That's how our society is structured. So I see it playing out as that's good enough now, Ben, for you and I to treat one another as adults.
As peers.
As peers.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So that means you said, well, how does that play out? So practically speaking, what that means to me is you're now negotiating for your living space with me. It's not granted anymore. It needs to fit within how I understand reality. Like if this is a partnership now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a partnership for me. I strive to be more and more refined, increasingly refined in that integrity, which has to do with word and deed
Mm-hmm.
align, and actions are intentional.
Mm-hmm.
So, insofar as it goes with other human beings, there's almost always words involved, some statement of intent.
Right.
If it's not pretty clearly implied by the context. So is that enough? Am I answering your question clearly enough in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what does that mean? So how does that play out?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then that partnership. So this is the and Ben and I have spoken explicitly about this. We've addressed this. We're in the process of addressing this. That there's a jeopardy that has to do with that failure to identify properly. A scope creep, I'll say, of the parent or child identification into adulthood, which I think I see egregious examples of that in my family of origin. I think that's what I'm observing.
Okay.
So what is the extent of the harm there? How do we address that jeopardy? So the harm has something to do with, we say that we're negotiating as peers, but the matter of fact is that unconsciously we are manipulating one another's behavior, I'll say, by falsely identifying with father and son, parent and child. And I'm, yeah, so that's any thoughts that you have about that? Have you seen examples of, in your own life, have you seen positive examples of father and son partnerships that play out over the course of adulthood?
Think about that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So any words that any wisdom that you think anything that you can impart to help set us up for success there? Because the risk, there's two risks in my mind. There's a balance to walk, ideally, is what I'm aiming at. Mm-hmm. And the risk on one side is, I'll say, an estrangement, some degree of estrangement, which I've definitely been party to. I've definitely fallen off of that side of the beam, so to speak, in other relationships in my life. Marnie probably the most pronounced. Mm-hmm. The other side is that enmeshed side, I'll call it, which is that has to do with the over-identification, or the incorrect loss of attention upon the correct identification. Mm-hmm. So then how do we walk that? Any wisdom that you could convey that would help us walk that beam between those two failure states?
Well, I guess what I was thinking and feeling is, like, we all agree as a society that individuals are adult at 18. But that's just an arbitrary construct of 18, because we give people privileges associated with an age. But emotionally, people aren't adults at 18. Most people aren't adults until their late 20s, because our brains keep developing. So even though you might want him to be your peer at 18, emotionally and developmentally, it's unlikely he could be your peer. Doesn't mean you can't interact with him as if he is, but in reality, he's not going to be your peer yet. But you can say those words to each other and act as if you are, and be working with that idea. I think we as a society have these sort of arbitrary rules, like at 18 you're this, and I've seen through what I do that people aren't mature or aren't capable of certain things at 18. They can go to war, they can kill people, they can do stuff, they can vote. That comes with this privilege we've given 18-year-olds, I guess. But in terms of, like, come back to what you said earlier too about identity, what I've seen through my work is people don't really know who they are until they're into their late 20s. In general, they really don't get that sense, that internal understanding of self. And maybe that's connected to the brain needs to keep developing. Maybe, I don't really know, but that's just what I've seen. That people aren't fully identified at whatever they identify as until their late 20s, early 30s. And I have a skewed population because of what I do, obviously, but that's what I've seen.
When you say skew, you think it skews the population that you're exposed to. Tell me if I got this right. The skew would be older than the mean of the general population.
Yeah.
Because you deal with people who are more troubled, people that have a harder time.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the average age of I think I shared this with you once before, the person who walks in here is 27.
If you did, I don't remember that. So 27. Okay, so that's probably very helpful. That's probably
and people say
helpful.
Saturn return. You've heard of the Saturn return?
I don't know what it means. I've heard people say it.
Astrologically, the Earth goes around the sun every 28 years. And astrologers believe that any trauma at birth will show up. Beginning at like 27 years, it starts to percolate inside us, and at 28 it reveals itself more fully because of that lunar cycle, which people can think about spirituality or related to spirituality too. But how I've seen that in my work is any trauma from birth or trauma along the way doesn't start to rise to the surface until people in their late 20s. And maybe that's because cognitively they can handle it now. I guess. I don't know for sure, I'm guessing, but that's what I've assumed from most people walk into my office are 27 to 32.
Okay.
Because they're finally asking those deeper questions of identity that don't seem to arise for most people. But again, I have this limited population. I'm not working with the whole world or the whole city per se. So but to come back to you and Ben, I think it can make perfect sense to see him, perceive him as your peer. In reality, I don't know if he's actually capable of being your peer.
Okay, so that's very helpful. I, for whatever reason, have like 23, 24 in my mind as the completion of, the substantial completion of neurological development of the brain. So I am aware of that. Okay.
We should probably end in about 5 minutes.
Okay. What's your observation? What are the best markers of adulthood that you can articulate?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll say that this is what's coming. The first thing that's coming to mind. It's linear, rational decision making that's coupled with a constant sense of self. Because we talked about like fragmentation before of self.
Yeah.
I think when there's lack of fragmentation and the self feels consistent, like a whole,
yeah,
then people's linear rational thought tends to accompany that.
Thank you. I think that's beautiful. I think that where that takes my attention internally anyway is to that idea of the primacy of the relationship with God. So there's identification with the gestalt, so to speak, and then the fragmentation or individuation cascades down from there. And then there's a sense of there's the honest sense of, I'll say, identity in that context, knowing that that whole is constantly shifting, it's dynamic. So that sense of self is necessarily also shifting. So that's the misapprehension of the sense of identity. So if the neurology is still changing, the sense of identity is going to be, I would imagine, fairly. I mean, my own sense of identity, like I still don't know truly, wholly who I am. I think that's an endless mystery.
I do too.
Nonetheless, I notice on a daily basis that I act based upon a character, I'll say, which is an identification.
Mm-hmm.
So the purification of that character? Well, if the physiology is in a natural biological phase of maturation,
Mm-hmm.
which it does until probably mid-20s sometime, not 18,
Right.
then that sense of identity is necessarily going to be more difficult to track, because it's probably shifting to a greater degree across time. Okay.
And it's interesting, it makes me think of schizophrenia.
Yeah.
And early onset tends to be around 17, 18, 19. Later onset can be like late 30s, early 40s. So it makes sense to me that if people sort of can't bring the fragments together, then they almost become more fragmented, and then schizophrenia is this word we put on it.
Yeah. That's our modern idiom for something that's been around probably forever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it probably, I would guess that its prevalence tracks according to how committed the traditions of a society are to the nature of reality.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Okay, well that that's a obvious place to conclude for purposes of today. I will state that my intent is to see how it goes, but to say, okay, relationship with God, relationship with Ben, and I think, so let me ask you this, the best I am deliberately, so this is an imposition. So I'm deliberately asking him and insisting, I guess I'll say, that he author his life, that he tells me what it is that he wants to do with his life for some appreciable period of time. And then I will participate more or less in that, dependent upon how I guess I feel I want to participate in that. I feel compelled to participate in that story. So is that overdoing it? To ask to ask him to tell me? When do I, or maybe a better way of asking that is at what point do I determine that that's harmful to insist upon that? Like if it isn't forthcoming, at what point do I say, okay? Because I imagine the point at which I would stop asking for that is at the point at which I am convinced that it's a plausible story, that I think it's actually achievable and uplifting, life affirming for him.
Right, if he can't tell you, then he can't tell you what the answer is until he knows the answer.
Okay.
If he knows, that's great. I think most 18-year-olds can't answer that question in a knowing.
Yeah, which I'm telling him, and I'm saying that you're not going to know, but pick something and see how it goes. I think that has to do, at minimum, what you discover is that was not the right way to go.
Right.
If you short of taking that responsibility for saying this is the way that I'm going to go,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how you actually get good information to work with to make a better choice the next time.
It makes me think that's why I've always thought of like my college years as an extended adolescence.
Yeah.
Like figuring out who I was, and I needed the freedom of that space away from mom and dad and their ideas of me or their rules of me or their concepts of me to then fully come into my own. And I think for me and for a lot of people, college is this experimentation, this petri dish of self, of figuring out who you truly are, and then getting to where you're finally going to end up.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Gary.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it a lot.